Hi everyone, welcome back to Mangosteen. Do you find yourself asking these questions? Why am I making more money than ever but feel so poor? Why can I never keep up with the price of property? Why is everything so expensive? And why does this feel like it's true for everyone? If these are questions that you've been asking yourself, or if this is a vibe that you've been getting in your mind lately, stay tuned. Welcome to Mangosteen's RINSED. This series, we're going to be answering why we invest the way we do. Part 1 is going to cover the modern day property experience. Is there a property crisis? While part 2 asks, is there a cost of living crisis? And then we're going to talk about what I believe to be the real crisis. And then in part 3, we're going to start forecasting into the future and see what we can see as trends and what opportunities might exist for us. So remember, none of what I'm discussing here is financial advice, but it is going to be super intriguing. It's going to be discussed mostly from the perspective of an Australian or New Zealander. However, if you're in any part of the developed world, the USA, Canada, UK, South Africa, etc., this more or less equally applies to you. It was my early teens when something didn't add up for me. My father was an avid property investor from the late 90s to the early 2000s. As a child, I would attend open homes and observe his involvement in property development. I have a couple distinct memories from this time as a young teenager. House prices grew faster than wages. House prices were growing at about 8% per year, whereas incomes grew at only around 3%. I knew this, and the conclusion that I made is, wow, home ownership would be naturally exclusionary over time. Less people would be able to buy houses as time progressed because incomes weren't keeping up with the price of property. The other thing that I thought was, hey, these properties would become less and less attractive to own as the investment return or the rental yield on these properties would have to decline, as rents on the properties would have to grow at the rate of incomes broadly, otherwise taking up more share of people's incomes in order to support rent, or house prices would stagnate. And what I didn't realize is that that's exactly what has happened. So in the mid-90s, rental yields in Australia were around 9%, and in the 2020s, they have dropped to around 4%. And that is to reflect that rents have only gone up at a rate in line with incomes broadly, and they probably have gone up a little bit faster and they're taking up more share for people, but they're being limited in their ability to grow and support the capital valuations or the monetary valuations of these properties. And that's what must happen over time. If properties grow at 8% a year, but rents can only grow at 3 to 4 to 5% a year, rental yields have to decline. And so we can see that's happening. What I didn't realize at the time was this was intricately linked to broader problems in our economy. And that's what we're going to talk about in more detail. So in order to understand a property transaction, you have to understand the two components of a property transaction. One being the real house that is being traded between the people, like bought and sold. And the second is the nominal asset or the medium on which that property is being transacted for, which in most people's cases is their national currency, the Australian dollar, the New Zealand dollar, the Canadian dollar, the US dollar, etc., etc. So what we have here is a graph that we're probably all familiar with, which is incomes of full-time working employees and median house price growth in Australia. And we're familiar with this divergence that property prices are outpacing incomes and the ownership of property or of a residential house is becoming naturally exclusionary. And I mean, this is Australia, but we're all familiar with this across the entire Western world. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US, UK, you name it, right? And we're often sold this story that, hey, there's this lack of housing supply. We're not building enough houses. And on the right, what we've got is annual dwelling completions in Australia per capita. Now, what's interesting is that, yes, we have been building less houses over time. We had a peak in the 70s. And since then, we've been declining the amount of houses we've been building on a per capita basis over the last 40 years. However, houses don't exist for 1 year. They get added to a housing stock that lasts for 40, 50 years or so. And so what we have to understand is the overall housing stock. So this is the housing stock of the 5 main Anglosphere countries, the New Zealand, Australia, US, Canada, and the United Kingdom. And what we can see is over the last 35 years, their housing stock has increased on a per capita basis, meaning that on a per capita basis, housing is more abundant to the individual than what it was 30 years ago, which is very interesting. Houses are still being built at a rate faster than they are depreciating or being destroyed out of the market. That is, as houses degrade and they no longer become usable by the people. Now, this is consistent across all 5 of these markets. So if houses are more abundant today in the market on a per capita basis, why do they keep going up in price? Now, this analysis is very broad, and you could say that there are other reasons why maybe prices go up. Maybe people are choosing to live in smaller houses, or there's less people occupying these houses, or that they're smaller. And these things are valid critiques, but what we can say is broadly, at a broad base, houses are more abundant today than what they have been historically. So why do they take so much more purchasing power to buy? So in order to discuss why houses continue to go up in price, I first have to introduce you to a little bit of history. And so excuse me while I go through some very technical stuff, but I hope this forms a good basis from which you can understand why things have happened. Now, in 1971, the US abandoned the gold standard. This was known as the Bretton Woods system. And basically, the world was pegged to the US dollar, and the US dollar was pegged to gold. And they set a price for gold, and it had a very stable price, as you can see, for 150 years up until 1971, when the US finally abandoned the gold standard. And now we can see that gold's price has climbed up and up and up and up and up, and it has gone higher and higher and higher out to today's, $2,600 US an ounce, right? Now, that massive increase in gold price that we can see here reflects about an 8% compounded annual growth rate, which means that the price has on average increased 8% per year for the last 53 years. Interestingly, on the right-hand side, we've got the US M2 money supply, which is a measure of the overall supply of money in the economy. And what we can see is that for the last 53 years, the US money supply has grown at about 7% per annum compounded annual growth rate. On average, they have increased the money supply into the US economy and into the world by about 7% every year. That is very interesting. Those growth rates are very close to each other. Gold is appreciating at a rate similar to that of the increase in US money supply. Of course, the first question you just got is, what has this got to do with Australia and New Zealand? And of course, I'm going to show you right now. So we can see that our exchange rate between the US and the New Zealand dollar and the Australian dollar and the US dollar has not broadly changed in the last 30, 40 years. We can see that we kind of started at 0.6 to 0.8. We've had some drops down. We've had some drops up, or some movements upwards where there's some strength in the US dollar, in the Australian and New Zealand dollar. And then we're broadly back down to where we started 30, 40 years ago. And so how have we kept a relatively fixed exchange rate when the US dollar continues to increase its money supply so vastly over the last 55 years? Well, the answer is that we've had to increase our money supply as well. And on the right, you can see New Zealand and Australia, broad money supply. And you can see that over the last 53 years, we have increased our Australian and New Zealand dollar supply by about 7 to 9% per annum compounded annual growth rate, broadly at the same rate at which the US has increased its money supply. And so by virtue of that, we have a broadly fixed exchange rate, barring some general increases and decreases that may last 5, 10 years at any one time, but over a long enough time horizon is broadly flat. So we've talked about the Australian and New Zealand dollar and their increasing in supply, but what has this got to do with housing, and why did I use gold as an example prior? Well, what I want to do is introduce this idea of monetary goods. Now, I want to say that gold is a monetary good. For the past 5 millennia, gold has been used as a monetary asset, and we can see why. We can see why in this graph. So when we take the gold price and we adjust it for the US M2 money supply, we can see that over the long run, gold has a broadly fixed ratio between the money supply and the price of gold. And so what we can see is that, it might fluctuate down, it might fluctuate up, but it broadly stays flat, with the exception of this big gold bubble that we had in the late 70s, early 80s, which everyone knows to be a bubble, and you can kind of see it really clearly. Why? Because suddenly gold's price as a portion of the money supply spikes upwards much higher than what it has ever traditionally been, and then comes back down into its normal valuation range, right? And that's kind of a broadly unique property of gold, and we can see why. Like, if you look up to the top right, we've got the aluminium price adjusted for money supply. Now, aluminium is a really easily recyclable and abundant metal, and it has some industrial uses, right? It's a really, really useful metal for industrial uses. But we generally, every year, we get better at mining it, and it becomes more abundant, and we get better at recycling it. And so what we can see is that over the past 20 odd years, the aluminium price adjusted for money supply has declined. And that is that industrial metals don't tend to hold their value versus the money supply. And so that's what that's my kind of premise, is that things that are industrial or have broad utility, we get better at making them, right? And the economy gets stronger. And over time, when adjusted for money supply, they in fact get cheaper. And I want to introduce this concept in our next slide, where we're going to relate it back to property. Here we have the house price index for the 5, again, Anglosphere countries: New Zealand, Australia, the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. And what we can see is what we are all very aware of, that house prices go up over time, and New Zealand and Australia are by far the biggest culprits, with their house prices increasing the most over the last 35 odd years. Now, what's way more interesting is that when we adjust the house prices index for the increase in money supply in each of these economies, we get a very different picture. And in fact, what we can see is over the last 32 years, house prices have in fact gotten cheaper when adjusted for money supply. And in fact, Australia has gotten cheaper by almost as much as the United States. The housing supply has been, or the price of houses has been manipulated by the supply of money. And what we can see is that there is only one occasion where house prices generally went up against money supply, and that was in the lead up to the GFC, in that sort of 5 years prior to the GFC, when everyone was making bucket loads of money. House prices were appreciating against the money supply. And that is really the only time that that has ever happened. And so the easiest way for us to ever identify a bubble in, say, housing or in any other commodity is to look at its price versus money supply and see if it's going up over and above an unusual level in the increase in money supply. And that will elucidate a bubble. So you can see here, we had house prices going up. They went up really fast. We had the GFC. Everything calmed down for a few years. And now we've been going back up again. But when adjusted for money supply, we've had house prices continue to decline. We have this blip up during the GFC, and then we have our crash, and then we continue to go back on our normal trend of houses generally getting cheaper over time versus money supply. And so, to me, like gold, houses have been monetized. We are using our house as a savings account, and this graph shows you exactly why, because it absorbs this increase in money supply for us. So we can see that house prices generally go down when adjusted for money supply. And the rate at which they are going down broadly reflects the rate at which they're being constructed. That is to say that the supply of new houses grows at something between 1% and 2% per annum, depending on the economy. And that is broadly in line with the rate at which they go down in price when you take out that money supply inflation signal. So to summarize part 1, money creation by governments and central banks is the core driver of increasing asset prices. Houses being the assets that we're most familiar with on our day-to-day experience. Houses have been monetized in response to an abundant fiat money printing as a form of a savings account. Houses have been a superior form of savings than the typical fiat currencies that we work with on a day-to-day basis, in our case, the New Zealand and Australian dollar. And while norms around housing have changed over the last 50 years, whether we live in large houses or small houses and the types of houses that we choose to live in, there is not any substantial evidence of a lack of housing supply, as dwellings per capita has increased slightly over the last 30 years. So this concludes part 1. Part 2 will look at the broader cost of living crisis, and part 3 will start making some projections out into the future to try and understand how this might play out over the next couple of decades. If you found this content useful, please like, subscribe, and please hit me up for any clarifications or anything that you'd like me to go into further depth, as I will be making additional components to the RINSED series. Thanks.